Malfoy Manor does not forgive strangers. When silk becomes a shroud and ancient walls demand a blood tax, will love burn through the darkness, or will it simply become another gilded shadow in the castle of silence? This story was written with love for you. The first thing Hermione Granger Malfoy realized upon waking was that luxury had a very specific, intimidating weight. It wasn't just the thread count of the emerald silk sheets, which felt suspiciously like sliding into a vat of melted butter, or the fact that the bed was so cavernous she had actually lost Draco sometime during the night. It was the silence. The Malfoy Manor didn't just hold silence, it curated it, polished it, and displayed it like a family heirloom. She blinked against the soft, persistent glow of the morning sun, filtering through heavy velvet curtains. Her mind, usually a neatly indexed library of tasks and schedules, was currently a hazy fog of white lace, expensive champagne, and the memory of Draco's hand burning a permanent mark of ownership onto the small of her back during their final dance. They were married. The thought hit her with the force of a stupefy spell, followed immediately by the realization that she was now technically the mistress of a house that had once tried to swallow her whole. Hermione. The voice was a low, sleep-roughened rasp. She turned her head, a feat that required navigating at least 4 oversized down pillows, and found him. Draco was propped up on one elbow, his silver blonde hair a chaotic nest that would have horrified his mother, Narcissa. He looked softer than she had ever seen him, the sharp, defensive edges of his face blunted by the aftermath of exhaustion, and perhaps a hint of genuine contentment. "You're staring," he murmured, a slow, crooked smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Is there a smudge on the pristine Malfoy reputation already, or do I simply look that ravishing at 7 in the morning?" Hermione felt the familiar heat rise to her cheeks, the same spark of irritation and attraction that had defined their last 2 years. "I was actually wondering how it's possible for one person to occupy only 10% of a bed, while the other 90% is taken up by whatever this is." She waved a hand vaguely at the sea of silk. "I feel like I'm trapped in a very expensive cocoon." Draco chuckled, the sound vibrating through the mattress. He reached out, his fingers grazing her shoulder. The touch was light, almost tentative, a silent inquiry that had become their shorthand. "It's called comfort, Hermione. I know it's a foreign concept to someone who spent 7 years sleeping on stone floors and in damp tents, but I promise you won't die from a lack of lumbar support." "I like lumbar support," she protested, though she didn't pull away. Instead, she watched the way his thumb traced the line of her collarbone. The static between them was different today. The can't-stand-it phase of their relationship had long since burnt out, leaving behind a magnetic pull that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Yet there was still a tremor of uncertainty in her chest. She was Hermione Granger. She belonged in messy libraries, in the frantic halls of the ministry, in a cozy flat with overflowing bookshelves and mismatched mugs. She didn't belong in a fortress of cold marble and ancestral portraits that whispered judgments as she passed. "What is that look?" Draco asked, his eyes darkening as he read the flicker of doubt in her expression. The playfulness vanished, replaced by that guarded, watchful stillness she knew all too well. The "I've made a terrible mistake" look. "Is it the curtains?" I can burn them if it's the curtains." "It's not the curtains, Draco," she sighed, finally sitting up. The silk slid down her skin, and she instinctively reached for the thick, sensible robe she'd left on the mahogany chair nearby. Before she could move, Draco's hand caught her wrist. The contact was visceral. His skin was warm, his grip firm but not restrictive. For a moment, they simply stayed like that, a tableau of friction and unspoken questions. "You're overthinking," he said softly. "I can hear your brain whirring from here. It's louder than the house elves in the kitchens." "I am not overthinking. I am assessing," she corrected, her voice regaining its usual academic crispness. "I am assessing the fact that I am now expected to navigate a house that has more wings than a golden snitch, while pretending I know which fork to use for the third course of a breakfast I didn't even ask for." Draco pulled her back down, his movement fluid and surprising. He didn't let go of her wrist until she was tucked against his side, her head resting on his chest. She could hear the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, the only thing in this entire daunting estate that felt truly familiar. "First of all," Draco said, his breath stirring her curls, "there is no third course for breakfast unless my mother is visiting, and she's currently in France. Second, the house elves are terrified of you. Mippy spent 20 minutes yesterday debating whether she should iron your socks or if that would be considered an infringement on your muggle-born agency." Hermione couldn't help it. A small, traitorous laugh escaped her. "She didn't." "She did. I told her you'd likely prefer to iron them yourself, using some sort of complex steam-based logic, and she nearly fainted." He turned slightly, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "Stay here. The world hasn't realized we're awake yet. Let's keep it that way." For a few minutes, the tension ebbed. The warmth of his body against hers acted as a buffer against the imposing grandeur of the room. She felt a surge of trust, a sense that as long as they were in this bed, in this private bubble, the world was manageable. But then, a sharp crack echoed through the room. Hermione nearly jumped out of her skin, her hand instinctively flying to the nightstand where her wand lay. Standing at the foot of the bed was a tiny, trembling house elf wearing a pristine, miniature Malfoy-crested tunic. "Master Draco, Mistress Hermione, Mippy is most humbly apologizing for the intrusion of the morning," the elf squeaked, her eyes wide as saucers. "But the morning owls have arrived, and the ministry is sending urgent missives, and the Great Hall is prepared for the first matrimonial fast break." Draco groaned into Hermione's shoulder. "Mippy, leave. Go. Vanish. If I see a single missive before I've had coffee, I will personally see to it that you are forced to work for Arthur Weasley for a week." Mippy shrieked in a mix of horror and delight, then bowed so low her nose touched the carpet before disappearing with another loud pop. The silence returned, but the spell was broken. Hermione sat up again, this time with purpose. "Matrimonial fast break. Draco, tell me that's just a fancy word for toast." Draco sat up as well, running a hand through his hair and looking profoundly annoyed. "It's a Malfoy tradition, a 5-course meal designed to prove that even after a night of celebration, we remain perfectly composed and capable of digesting heavy sauces." "I can't do it," Hermione said, her voice rising slightly. "I can't sit at that table and pretend to be composed. I haven't even found my hairbrushes yet, Draco. My hair is currently a sentient entity, and I'm fairly certain I left my dignity back at the reception. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet meeting the plush carpet. She felt vulnerable, not just because of her state of dress, but because the sheer scale of the room made her feel small. Everything here was designed to make one feel significant, yet it had the opposite effect on her. Draco watched her, his gaze tracking the frantic way she began to pace the small patch of carpet. "Hermione, stop! Look at me!" She didn't stop. "And the portraits. I have to walk past your great-aunt Walburga's second cousin just to get to the bathroom. She told me my posture was distinctly plebeian at 3 a.m. She's been dead since 1890. Her opinion on posture is literally irrelevant," Draco snapped, though there was a glint of amusement in his eyes. He got out of bed, moving with that effortless, feline grace that always made her feel slightly clumsy in comparison. He stepped into her path, catching her shoulders. "Listen to me," he said, his voice dropping to that low, intense register that usually signaled the end of an argument. "You are the smartest, most terrifyingly capable witch of our age. You took down a Dark Lord. You've rewritten more laws in 3 years than the Wizengamot did in a century. Are you honestly telling me you're intimidated by a breakfast table and a few oil paintings?" Hermione looked up at him, her chest heaving. "It's not the table, Draco. It's the expectation. I feel like I'm wearing a costume that's 3 sizes too big, and eventually everyone is going to notice I don't fit." The warmth in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden, sharp coldness, not directed at her, but at the thought she'd expressed. "You fit. Because I say you fit. You fit because this house belongs to you as much as it does to me. And if any of my ancestors give you trouble, I'll have them moved to the cellar where they can discuss their pedigree with the spiders." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of him, sandalwood, parchment, and something uniquely Draco, filled her senses. The magnetic pull was back, stronger than the fear. "Now," he whispered, "we are going to go down there. We are going to ignore the third course. I will steal your toast. You will tell me I'm a prat, and we will survive the morning. Understood?" Hermione felt the tension in her shoulders break. She nodded, a small, tentative smile touching her lips. "Understood. But if there's kippers, I'm leaving." "Fair enough. I hate kippers too." He stepped back, giving her space to breathe, but the air still felt heavy with the unspoken weight of their new reality. As she turned to find her clothes, she didn't see the way Draco's expression shifted, the way the mask of confidence faltered for a fraction of a second, revealing the hollow echo of his own guilt. He had brought her here, to this place of shadows, and as he watched her struggle to find her footing, he wondered if his love was a gift or a very beautiful gilded cage. He gripped the edge of the mahogany dresser, his knuckles whitening. The static of the manor seemed to hum in his ears, a reminder that the happily ever after was only just beginning, and the foundation of their new life was still settling into the ancient, stubborn earth of his heritage. "Hermione," he called out as she disappeared into the dressing room. "Yes." "Try to find the blue dress, the one with the silver embroidery. It makes you look like you're about to declare war on the sun." A muffled laugh came from behind the door. "Is that a compliment, Malfoy?" "It's an observation, Granger. Get used to it." He turned toward the window, looking out over the sprawling, misty grounds of the estate. The morning was bright, but the shadows of the manor were long, and he knew that the gentle peace of this room wouldn't last once they stepped beyond the threshold. The seesaw of their lives, the constant shift between his world and hers, was about to begin in earnest. The dressing room was less a room and more a cathedral dedicated to the vanity of the Malfoy lineage. Floor-to-ceiling mirrors framed in tarnished silver reflected Hermione from every conceivable angle, forcing her to confront the fact that even in her most frazzled state, the manor insisted on making her look like a tragic heroine in a Gothic novel. She fumbled with the blue dress Draco had mentioned. It was a masterpiece of wizarding haute couture, the silk so fine it felt like liquid moonlight, but the fastenings were a geometric nightmare. "It's a dress, Hermione, not a riddle from a sphinx," she hissed to her reflection, her fingers tangling in a row of tiny pearl buttons that seemed to migrate every time she reached for them. Outside the door, she heard the rhythmic thud of Draco's boots. He was already dressed. Of course he was, probably looking like he'd stepped off the cover of Witch Weekly without a single hair out of place. The discrepancy between his effortless elegance and her frantic struggle was a familiar friction, a reminder of the years they had spent on opposite sides of a social chasm. "Do you require assistance? Or should I send for a team of specialized Gringotts curse-breakers to handle those buttons?" Draco's voice drifted through the wood, laced with that infuriating melodic drawl. "I am perfectly capable of dressing myself, thank you," Hermione snapped, finally snagging a button, only for it to slip through her trembling fingers. She let out a frustrated growl, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the fabric. It wasn't just the dress. It was the atmospheric pressure of the house, the way the very air seemed to expect her to fail. The door creaked open. Draco didn't wait for an invitation. He never did. He stepped into the room, his presence immediately narrowing the space. He had traded his pajamas for a charcoal grey suit that screamed old money and quiet power. He looked at her, really looked at her, his gaze travelling from her messy curls down to her bare, stubborn feet, and finally to her flushed face. "Turn around," he commanded softly. "Draco? Turn around before you tear the silk and Mippy has a nervous breakdown." Hermione huffed but obeyed, presenting him with her back. She felt the sudden, sharp intake of breath from him, a momentary break in his composure that she felt rather than saw. Then his hands were there. His fingers were cool against the heated skin of her spine, a tactile friction that sent a jiver through her entire frame. He began to work the buttons with a practiced, steady precision. "You're shaking," he murmured, his voice vibrating just behind her ear. "I'm not shaking. I'm vibrating with intellectual energy," she lied, though the way her breath hitched as his knuckles brushed her shoulder blades betrayed her. "Is that what we're calling it now?" He finished the last button and didn't pull away. Instead, he rested his hands on her waist, his thumbs tracing the curve of her hips through the silk. The silence in the dressing room changed. It stopped being judgmental and became thick, magnetic, charged with the kind of tension that made the oxygen feel scarce. Hermione leaned back against him, just for a second, letting the solid weight of his chest support her. Trust was still a fragile thing, a bridge they were building even as they walked across it. "Why does everything have to be so much, Draco? The bed, the breakfast, The buttons? It's like the house is trying to drown me in its own importance. Draco turned her around to face him, his hands sliding up to cup her face. His silver eyes were unreadable, a storm of grey and flint. Because for centuries, the Malfoys thought that if they surrounded themselves with enough gold and silk, the world wouldn't notice the rot in there. He caught himself, remembering her distaste for his self-deprecation. He cleared his throat, his expression hardening into a mask of regal indifference. It's a defense mechanism, Hermione. But you don't need it. You're the only thing in this house that's actually real. He leaned down, his lips ghosting over her forehead, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache with a sudden, violent affection. But as quickly as the warmth appeared, he withdrew, his armor snapping back into place. Now, put on some shoes. We have a breakfast to survive, and I refuse to let my wife be outshone by a collection of sentient oil paintings. The journey to the Great Hall was a gauntlet of ancestral disapproval. Hermione clutched Draco's arm, her heels clicking rhythmically against the black marble floors. Every portrait they passed seemed to track their movement. The archery Malfoys whispered behind their fans, and a particularly grim-looking wizard in a high collar actually scoffed as they turned the corner. "Ignore them," Draco muttered, his grip on her hand tightening. Old Lucius III hasn't had a new thought since the 17th century. He's just bitter because your hair has more personality than his entire lineage. "Draco!" she whispered, yelled, though a giggle threatened to break through her nerves. They reached the double oak doors of the dining hall. Two house elves stood like sentinels, bowing so low their ears brushed the floor. As the doors swung open, Hermione felt a wave of vertigo. The table was a mahogany continent, set with silver that gleamed like polished bone, and crystal that fractured the morning light into 1,000 jagged rainbows. "Where are we supposed to sit?" she whispered, looking at the vast expanse of empty chairs. "Are we expecting the rest of the Wizengamot?" "Just us," Draco said, leading her to the far end. "But the house likes to be prepared in case a stray monarch drops by for eggs." As they sat, the matrimonial fast break began. Platters of food appeared with rhythmic pops, poached eggs nesting in beds of asparagus, smoked salmon arranged like delicate roses, pastries dusted with silver leaf. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly overwhelming. Hermione stared at a small, intricately carved silver dome in front of her. She lifted it tentatively, only to find a single, perfectly glazed quail egg resting on a bed of truffle shavings. "I can't eat this," she said, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "It's too pretty. It's like eating a museum exhibit." Draco, who was already systematically dismantling a piece of dry toast, looked up. "Then don't eat it. Eat the toast. I've already established that I'm a savage who steals from his wife. You might as well join me in my decline." He slid a plate of buttered bread toward her, his eyes shining with a rare, genuine playfulness. For a moment, the tension shifted. The repulsion she felt toward the setting was mitigated by the approach of his humor. She reached out, her fingers brushing his as she took the plate. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the toast, and for not letting me drown." "Don't thank me yet," he warned, his tone shifting back to that guarded, cool reserve. "We haven't reached the tea service. That's when the portraits usually start hurling insults about tea leaf reading. The meal proceeded in a strange dance of warmth and cold. One moment they were laughing about the absurdity of a silver-plated butter knife. The next, a shadow would cross Draco's face as he glanced at the empty seat at the head of the table, his father's seat. The ghost of Lucius Malfoy didn't need to be in the room to make his presence felt. It was in the curve of the silverware, the stiffness of the napkins, the very weight of the air. Hermione felt the doubt creeping back in. She watched Draco, his perfect posture, the way he navigated the complex etiquette of the meal without even thinking. He belonged here. He was a part of this machinery. And she was a gear from a completely different machine, forced into a system that wasn't built for her. "You're doing it again," Draco said, his voice sharp, cutting through her internal monologue. He set his teacup down with a controlled clink that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The assessing look. "Is the toast not up to ministry standards?" "It's not the toast, Draco, and you know it," she snapped, her frustration finally bubbling over. "I'm trying. I really am. But I feel like I'm performing. Every time I move, I'm waiting for someone, or some painting, to tell me I'm doing it wrong. I'm waiting for you to realize that I don't know how to be a Malfoy." Draco stood up so abruptly, his chair scraped harshly against the floor. The sound was a jagged tear in the fabric of the morning's forced peace. He walked around the table, his movements tense, his jaw set in a hard line. Hermione braced herself for the cold phase, for the withdrawal she had come to expect when she pushed too hard against his pride. Instead, he stopped beside her chair and reached down, his fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was possessive, desperate, and raw. "You think I want a Malfoy?" he hissed, his face inches from hers. "If I wanted a Malfoy, I could have married any number of vapid, pure-blood heiresses who know exactly which spoon to use for their soup and have the intellectual depth of a tea saucer. I married you, Hermione. I married the woman who corrected my wand movements in third year and who refuses to let me be the coward I was born to be." He pulled her up, forcing her to stand and face him. The tension between them was no longer about the house or the breakfast. It was the visceral, tactile friction of two people who were still learning how to be whole together. "This house is a graveyard," Draco said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "And you are the only thing in it that breathes. If you stop breathing, if you start acting like one of those ghosts on the wall just to fit in, then I really am lost." Hermione felt the sting of tears in her eyes. Her vulnerability, which she usually kept under lock and key, spilled over. She reached out, her hands gripping the lapels of his charcoal suit, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. "Then help me," she whispered. "Help me make this a home, Draco, because right now it's just a very big, very beautiful cage." He didn't answer with words. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the cool morning air. The magnetic pull was overwhelming, a silent promise that they would fight this battle together. But just as she thought he might kiss her, just as the warmth began to settle into her bones, he pulled back. The mask was back. The restrained, morally grey scion of the Malfoy line looked down at her with a flick of his previous arrogance. "Very well. If we are to make this a home, we must start with the library. I believe some of my ancestors more Questionable volumes need to be relocated to make room for your endless supply of light reading. He offered her his arm, his expression cool, but his fingers trembled slightly where they touched her sleeve. "The library?" Hermione asked, wiping a stray tear and trying to match his tone. "You mean the one with the restricted section that requires a blood sacrifice to enter?" "Precisely," Draco smirked, leading her toward the exit. "I thought we could start by reorganizing it alphabetically, or by level of lethality, whichever you prefer." As they stepped out of the dining hall, the doors clicking shut behind them, Hermione felt a flicker of hope. The seesaw had tilted back toward warmth, but the shadows of the corridor were long, and the house seemed to groan as if in protest of the changes she intended to bring. They walked together, two figures in a sea of marble, heading toward the heart of the labyrinth, unaware that the house had its own ways of protecting its secrets. Suddenly, a loud, crashing sound echoed from the direction of the west wing, the sound of shattering glass and a high-pitched elvish scream. Draco froze, his hand flying to his wand, his eyes widening with a sudden, sharp fear. "What was that?" Hermione whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. Draco didn't answer. He was already moving, pulling her along with him as the silence of the manor was replaced by a low, ominous thrumming that seemed to vibrate from the very stones beneath their feet. The morning's peace was gone, shattered as easily as the glass, leaving them to face the first real test of their union. The sound that ripped through the west wing was not merely the breaking of glass. It was the sound of the manor's pride being wounded. As Draco and Hermione rounded the corner, the air grew thick with the scent of ancient ozone and scorched lavender. The corridor was a disaster zone. A massive, floor-to-ceiling stained glass window, which had for centuries depicted the Malfoy coat of arms in excruciatingly expensive detail, had spontaneously imploded. Mippy was huddled in the center of the debris, her hands covering her face, wailing in a pitch that could have shattered what remained of the crystal sconces. "Mippy, stop that at once!" Draco's voice was like a whip, sharp and commanding, yet Hermione caught the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his grip on his wand. The elf looked up, her eyes wide and wet. "Master, the glass. It is not liking the change. The manor, it is. It is sensing the new magic, and it is rejecting the spirits of the old." Hermione stepped forward, ignoring the way the jagged shards of glass crunched beneath her sensible heels. She felt a strange, prickly sensation against her skin. The atmospheric pressure of the house was spiking, a magnetic disturbance that made the hair on her arms stand up. "What do you mean, rejecting the spirits, Mippy? It's a window. Windows don't have opinions." "In this house they do," Draco muttered, stepping in front of her. He looked at the empty frame, where the morning light now poured in, unfiltered, harsh and unforgiving. Without the coloured glass, the hallway looked drab, the shadows stripped of their regal pretension. The manor is attuned to the blood that dwells within it. It's been centuries since someone different has held the keys to the wards. Hermione felt a surge of indignation. "Different? You mean muggle-born, Draco? Say the word. It won't turn you into a toad." He turned to her, his face a mask of pale, strained composure. The warmth from the dressing room had vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged defensive wall. "I was trying to be diplomatic, Hermione. But if you want the blunt truth, the house is throwing a tantrum. It's been fed a diet of pure-blood arrogance for 1,000 years, and now it's being asked to digest a Gryffindor war hero who wants to put beanbags in the drawing room. It's having a bout of magical indigestion. Hermione crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. Well, it had better learn to adapt. I'm not a virus, and I won't be treated like one by a pile of sentient masonry. She walked toward the debris, her mind already cataloguing the spells needed to repair the damage. But as she raised her wand, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a sound made by an animal. It was the sound of stone grinding against stone. A nearby suit of armor, a hulking monstrosity of black iron that had belonged to a Malfoy who specialized in unconventional interrogations, suddenly lurched forward. Its visor clattered shut, and it raised a rusted halberd. "Hermione, get back!" Draco lunged, grabbing her waist and pulling her behind him, just as the halberd swung through the air, whistling inches from where she had stood. "It's attacking us!" Hermione gasped, her wand finally snapping into position. "In our own home?" "It's attacking you," Draco corrected, his voice tight with a mixture of fury and fear. "It sees you as an intruder. The wards haven't fully processed the marriage contract yet." He stepped forward, his wand leveled at the Iron Giant. "Depulso!" The spell hit the armor with a dull thud, but it barely staggered. The metal was infused with old, dark enchantments that fed off the house's own reservoir of magic. It began to stomp toward them, each footfall echoing like a hammer on an anvil. "I need to tie my magic to the foundation," Hermione shouted over the din. "If I can tap into the ley lines of the estate, I can force the house to recognize me." "That's suicide," Draco countered, parrying another blow from the halberd with a shimmering silver shield. "The Malfoy ley lines are saturated with generations of—" "I don't care what they're saturated with," she interrupted, her Gryffindor stubbornness flaring. "I am a Malfoy by law, and if this house wants a fight, I'll give it one." She didn't wait for his approval. Dropping to her knees, she pressed her palms flat against the cold marble floor. She closed her eyes, reaching out with her senses, past the silk and the dust, deep into the bedrock upon which the manor sat. She felt it almost immediately, a roiling, bitter sea of magic. It was cold, manipulative, and ancient. It tasted of copper and old parchment. It tried to push her out, a visceral alignment of forces designed to expel anything that didn't share the purity of its masters. "I am not going anywhere," she thought, her internal monologue becoming a rhythmic chant. "I am the foundation now. I am the change." Beside her, Draco was a whirlwind of movement. He was shouting incantations, his body a blur of charcoal grey as he danced around the possessed armor. He wasn't just fighting for her, he was fighting against his own history. Each spell he cast was a betrayal of the very things his ancestors had built. He looked broken and magnificent all at once, his restraint shattered by the raw necessity of protecting the woman he loved from the ghosts he had inherited. "Hermione, do it now!" he yelled, his voice cracking as the armor's halberd shattered his shield. She pushed. She poured every ounce of her warmth, her chaotic Gryffindor energy, and her unwavering belief in a better world into the cold veins of the house. For a heartbeat, there was a terrible friction, a magnetic pull that felt like it would tear her apart. The seesaw of the house's loyalty tilted violently. Then, with a sound like a long, exhaled breath, the tension snapped. The suit of armor froze mid-swing, its halberd clattering harmlessly to the floor. The low thrumming in the stones died away, replaced by a sudden, unnatural stillness. Even the portraits in the hallway went silent, their painted eyes wide with a mix of shock and begrudging respect. Hermione slumped forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hands were stained with dust, and her blue dress was ruined, but she felt a strange new connection to the walls around her. The house didn't love her, not yet, but it had accepted her. Draco was at her side in an instant, his hands frantic as he checked her for injuries. "Are you mad? You could have been flayed alive. The Malfoy magic is not something you just tap into like a library book." He was angry, furious even. But beneath the surface, Hermione saw the warmth returning, a desperate relief that made his eyes shimmer. He pulled her into a tight, crushing embrace, his face buried in her hair. "You're a nightmare," he whispered into her ear. "A brilliant, terrifying nightmare." "And you're a prat," she managed to say, her voice shaky but triumphant. "You should have seen your face. You actually looked worried about me." "I was worried about the carpet," he drawled, though he didn't let go. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his thumbs wiping a smudge of soot from her cheek. The bloodstains are notoriously difficult to remove from white marble. They stood there amidst the wreckage of the West Wing, a shattered window, a pile of junk mail, and the remnants of a centuries-old curse. It was messy, undignified, and entirely un-Malfoy. And yet, for the first time since she had arrived, Hermione felt a spark of genuine happiness. "We should probably clean this up," she said, looking at the mess. "Mippy will do it," Draco said, though he looked at the elf, who was still trembling in the corner. "Actually, no. Mippy, go get some tea. The strong kind. And maybe some of those biscuits with the chocolate tops." The elf blinked, then nodded vigorously and vanished. Draco turned back to Hermione, his expression softening into something more vulnerable. "I'm sorry," he said, the words falling between them like heavy stones. "I knew the house would resist, but I didn't think it would be this visceral. I should have protected you better." "You did protect me, Draco, but you have to realize that I'm not just a guest here. I'm your wife. I have to be able to fight my own battles with your ancestors." She reached out, taking his hand. His skin was cold, the betrayal of his own heritage still weighing on him. He felt like he had led her into a lion's den, forgetting that she was a lion herself. "Is this how it's going to be?" he asked, his voice low. "Every morning a new disaster? Every meal a tactical maneuver?" "Probably," Hermione admitted, a playful glint in her eyes. "But think of it this way. At least you'll never be bored. No more staring at the walls and contemplating the rot in the foundation, or whatever it is you do when you're being dramatic." Draco let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of genuine amusement that seemed to startle even the shadows. "I am not dramatic, Granger. I am merely atmospheric." "Oh, you're definitely atmospheric," she teased, leaning into him. The tactile friction of their bodies, the warmth of his breath against her forehead, the way his fingers curled around hers. It was all a reminder that despite the grand halls and the murderous armor, they were just two people trying to find a rhythm. They began to walk back toward the main part of the house, leaving the debris behind for a moment of peace. But as they passed the portrait of Draco's great-grandfather, The old man cleared his throat loudly. "She's a bit loud, isn't she, Draco?" the portrait remarked, squinting at Hermione. "And her wand work is unorthodox." Draco stopped, turned, and looked the portrait dead in the eye. "She's the mistress of this house, great-grandfather, and if you speak to her again without being addressed, I will have your canvas used for target practice by the Weasley twins." The portrait's mouth fell open in an indignant "Oh!" and he quickly shuffled out of the frame. Hermione looked at Draco, her heart swelling with a mix of surprise and affection. "You wouldn't really invite George over, would you?" Draco's smirk was slow and dangerous. "I might, if only to see the look on my mother's face when she finds out we've turned the ballroom into a testing ground for skiving snack boxes." They laughed together then, a clear, bright sound that echoed through the dusty corridors, breaking the oppressive silence of the manor. It was a small victory, a tiny shift in the emotional dynamics of their new life. But as they reached the grand staircase, Hermione noticed a strange, flickering light coming from the library doors. A rhythmic, pulsing glow, accompanied by the faint sound of singing. Draco's smile vanished. "What now?" "It sounds like a choir," Hermione whispered, her hand tightening on his arm. "The Malfoy library doesn't have a choir," Draco said, his voice dropping back into its guarded, tense register. "It has a collection of Gregorian chants that activate when someone tries to misalphabetize the dark arts section, but this sounds like Celestina Warbeck." They moved toward the library, the tension building with every step. The slow burn of their morning was quickly turning into a frantic scramble for sanity. As Draco pushed open the heavy oak doors, they were met with a sight that was neither ancient nor dark, but something far more terrifying to a Malfoy. A full-blown, magical, welcome home party, organized by a very enthusiastic, very misguided group of their friends who had bypassed the wards while the house was busy fighting Hermione. The library was filled with floating balloons, a banner that read, "Malfoy and the Mudblood, forever," courtesy of a very drunk Seamus Finnegan, and a group of Gryffindors who were currently trying to teach the Malfoy ancestors how to do a conga line. Draco froze in the doorway, his face turning a shade of white that rivaled his hair. Hermione felt a wave of hysterical laughter bubbling up in her chest. "Well," she whispered, leaning closer to him, "you wanted the house to feel more alive." Draco's knuckles whitened as he gripped the doorframe. "I'm going to kill them. I'm going to kill all of them, and then I'm going to burn this house to the ground." "Wait," Hermione said, her hand reaching out to stroke his arm. "Look at your great-aunt. She's actually smiling?" Indeed, the sternest woman in the Malfoy lineage was currently being serenaded by Neville Longbottom, who was showing her a particularly rare species of Mimbolus Mimbletonia. The emotional seesaw had tilted again, from the cold terror of a haunted house to the chaotic, warm absurdity of a life lived out loud. Draco looked at the scene, then at Hermione, his expression a complex map of horror, resignation, and, buried deep beneath it all, a flicker of something that looked remarkably like happiness. "This," he muttered, "is going to be a very long marriage." "The longest," she promised, her eyes shining. But as they stepped into the room, a sudden hush fell over the crowd. Ron Weasley stood at the far end of the room, holding a very old, very dusty bottle of Malfoy wine, his expression unreadable as he looked from Draco to Hermione. The tension in the room spiked, the betrayal of old friendships clashing with the trust of new alliances. The morning was far from over. The library, usually a sanctuary of hushed whispers and the scent of aging parchment, had been transformed into a theatre of the absurd. The air was thick with the smell of butterbeer and the faint, citrusy tang of Fred and George's Filibuster's no-heat fireworks, which were currently drifting lazily near the vaulted ceiling. Ron Weasley stood paralysed by the mahogany sideboard, clutching a bottle of 1945 Elf-made Reserve as if it were a live grenade. The silence that followed Draco and Hermione's entrance wasn't just quiet. It was a pressurized vacuum, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure that made Hermione's ears pop. "Malfoy," Ron finally said, his voice cracking slightly. He looked at the bottle, then at the pale, murderous expression on Draco's face, and finally at Hermione's soot-stained blue dress. We thought you might be stuck, you know, in the first morning of the rest of your lives sort of way. Harry said we should wait, but Ginny said you'd probably be starving since Malfoy probably eats nothing but silver spoons and air. Draco didn't move. He stood in the doorway, a statue of charcoal grey and icy indignation. The cold phase of his personality had returned with a vengeance, his jaw set so tightly that a small muscle in his cheek pulsed rhythmically. To Draco, this wasn't just a party, it was a desecration. The library was the soul of the manor, the place where his family's history, however dark, was kept in leather-bound silence. To see it filled with Gryffindors in colourful robes felt like a tactile friction against his very skin. "Out," Draco said. The word was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 years of entitlement. "Now, Draco, don't be a prat," Ginny Weasley said, stepping out from behind a stack of Transfiguration journals. She was wearing a bright red jumper that clashed violently with the emerald green wallpaper. "We bypassed the wards because Mippy looked like she was about to have a stroke when we saw her at the gate. Besides, Hermione needs a proper breakfast, not a matrimonial fast break that involves more forks than food." Hermione felt the internal conflict within her sharpen. On one hand, the sight of her friends was a lifeline, a warm, chaotic reminder of the world she belonged to. On the other, she could feel the radiating waves of distress coming from Draco. He was a man who lived by boundaries, and his home was the final, most sacred one. To have it breached by the very people who had spent years mocking him was a betrayal of the fragile safety they had built that morning. She stepped forward, her hand reaching for Draco's arm. His muscles were like iron beneath the silk of his suit. "Draco," she whispered, her voice a soft anchor. "They mean well." "They are in my library, Hermione," he hissed, not looking at her. "There is a Weasley holding my grandfather's favourite vintage, and Longbottom is currently traumatizing a portrait that has been in my family since the Crusades. This isn't meaning well. This is an occupation." The tension in the room was a living thing, a magnetic pull between the warmth of the Gryffindors and the biting frost of the Malfoy air. "Look," Harry Potter said, stepping forward with his usual awkward grace. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the shattered suit of armour they had passed in the hall. "We heard the noise. We thought something was wrong. The wards were screaming Malfoy. We didn't come to party. We came to make sure the house hadn't eaten her." Draco finally looked at Harry, The can't-stand-it look was there, but it was tempered by a begrudging recognition. They had fought on the same side eventually, but the scars of the past were not healed by a wedding ceremony. The house did try to eat her, as you so eloquently put it, and we handled it. Now, put the wine down, Weasley, before I hex your fingers into cocktail sausages. Ron quickly set the bottle down, looking relieved. The emotional seesaw tilted again. The immediate threat of a duel faded, but the awkwardness remained, heavy and stifling. Hermione felt the need to bridge the gap, to reconcile the two halves of her life that were currently staring at each other over a pile of smoked salmon and magical balloons. "Since you're here," Hermione said, her voice gaining its head girl authority, "you might as well help us. The West Wing window is gone, and the house is in a bit of a mood. If we're going to have a welcome home party, let's at least make it productive." She looked at Draco, a silent plea in her eyes. "Trust me. Let them in. Just a little." Draco's eyes searched hers. He saw her vulnerability, the way she was trying so hard to knit their worlds together. With a long, weary sigh, he loosened his grip on his wand. "Fine. But if a single drop of butterbeer touches the first edition potion texts, I am turning all of you into bookends." The next hour was a blur of high-energy chaos and tense diplomacy. Under Hermione's direction, the party became a repair crew. Harry and Ron were sent to secure the West Wing, their aura training making quick work of the lingering dark traces that had caused the armor to animate. Ginny and Neville began to soften the library, moving the more sinister-looking artifacts to the higher shelves and replacing them with the flowers Neville had brought. Draco remained in a corner, a glass of water in his hand, watching the proceedings like a king witnessing the sacking of his city. He was restrained, his exterior cool, but Hermione could see the internal guilt gnawing at him. He felt like he had failed to provide her with the peaceful, elegant life he'd promised. He felt like a host who had lost control of his own soul. Hermione navigated the room, laughing with Ginny one moment and checking on a repair spell the next. But her eyes always returned to Draco. She saw the way he winced when Ron laughed too loudly, the way he straightened a quill that had been moved an inch to the left. She walked over to him, leaning against the bookshelf beside his shoulder. "You're doing very well," she said softly. "I'm contemplating the merits of a mass obliviation," he replied, though the sharp edge of his voice had softened into a weary irony. "Is this what my life is now, Hermione? A series of loud people in bright clothes invading my personal space?" "It's a life with people who care about us," she countered. "It's messy and it's loud, but it's better than the silence we woke up to, isn't it?" Draco looked at her, his gaze lingering on the way the silver embroidery of her dress caught the light. The silence was predictable. This is atmospheric pressure I wasn't prepared for. He reached out, his hand ghosting over her waist, a fleeting touch of non-verbal intimacy that acted as a silent apology for his earlier frostiness. "You look exhausted." "I am," she admitted, letting her head rest against his shoulder for a brief second. "The house, the magic, everything. It's a lot for one morning." "Go sit," he commanded, his voice regaining its protective warmth. "I'll handle the Weasleys. I believe I can distract them with a tour of the wine cellar. It's the only way to get them out of my sight without bloodshed." Hermione watched him walk toward Ron and Harry, his gait regaining its aristocratic confidence. She saw him say something that made Harry laugh, and Ron looked suspiciously at his own shoes. He was trying. For her, he was letting his guard down, even if it was only a fraction of an inch. But as the group moved toward the door, leaving her alone in the library for a moment of quiet, the atmosphere shifted again. The welcome home banner flickered and died. The floating balloons suddenly lost their magic, dropping to the floor like lead weights. The temperature in the room plummeted. Hermione's breath hitched, a plume of white mist forming in front of her face. This wasn't her friend's doing. This was the house again. The Malfoy Manor was not finished with its protest. It had waited for the intruders to leave, and now it was narrowing its focus on the one person it truly resented. A shadow began to lengthen across the floor. Not the shadow of a person, but a jagged, ink-black stain that seemed to seep out from under the dark arts section. It moved with a predatory grace, creeping toward the center of the room. "Draco!" she called out, but her voice felt thin, swallowed by the sudden heavy silence. The doors to the library slammed shut with a finality that made the windows rattle. Hermione reached for her wand, but her fingers felt numb, the cold biting into her skin like a silver ring. The shadow rose from the floor, taking a formless, towering shape. It didn't speak, but it radiated a sense of profound ancestral hate. "You do not belong," a voice whispered in her mind. Not a human voice, but the collective echo of 1,000 years of Malfoy pride. "You are the grit in the oyster. You are the flaw in the diamond." Hermione backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. The tension was no longer between her and Draco. It was between her and the very concept of Malfoy. She felt the doubt she'd been carrying all morning turn into a crushing weight. Maybe she didn't belong. Maybe her presence was a betrayal of the order of things. The shadow lunged. Hermione threw up a shield, the gold light of her magic clashing with the ink-black darkness. The friction was visceral, a jarring impact that vibrated through her teeth. She was strong, she was intelligent, but she was fighting a ghost made of stone and blood. "Draco!" she screamed, her voice finally breaking through the house's suppression. The doors didn't just open, they exploded inward. Draco was there, his wand a blur of motion. He didn't use a standard defensive spell. He cast something old, something raw, a torrent of silver light that tore through the shadow like a blade through silk. "Get away from her!" he roared, his voice sounding deeper, more ancient than the house itself. He didn't stop until the shadow was reduced to nothing but a few wisps of smoke. He was breathing hard, his hair disheveled, his charcoal suit stained with the residue of the dark magic. He looked like a man who had just wrestled a demon, and in many ways he had. He didn't look at the room. He didn't look at the damage. He sprinted to Hermione, catching her just as her knees gave out. "I've got you," he gasped, pulling her into his lap as they sank to the floor. "I've got you. It's over. I'm so sorry, Hermione. I should never have left you alone." The emotional seesaw hit the bottom with a violent thud. The warmth of his arms was the only thing keeping her from shattering. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his shoulders, her tears finally falling. "It hates me," she sobbed into his chest. "The house, it wants me gone." Draco's grip tightened until it was almost painful. "Then we'll burn it. We'll leave. We'll go back to your flat, or we'll build a cottage in the middle of nowhere. I don't care about the name, and I don't care about the stones. He pulled back, his face inches from hers. His eyes were no longer silver or flint. They were soft, broken, and filled with a desperate, terrifying love. The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was overwhelming. The way he looked at her, as if she were the only thing holding the universe together. "I love you more than I hate this place," he whispered. "And I hate this place very much right now." Hermione looked at him, her breath hitching. The betrayal she felt from the house was being washed away by the trust she felt in him. He was willing to walk away from everything he was, his heritage, his wealth, his status, just to keep her safe. "No," she said, her voice regaining a ghost of its strength. "We won't leave. We won't let a bunch of dead men tell us where we can live." She reached up, her hand cupping his jaw. The bite of his silver ring was cold against her skin, but his pulse was warm and steady. "We're going to stay, and we're going to make it so bright in here that the shadows have nowhere left to hide." Draco closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. The tension between them shifted from fear to a slow, burning resolve. "Fine," he muttered, a hint of his usual smirk returning. "But I'm still keeping the wine cellar. Some things are too sacred to sacrifice." They sat together on the floor of the library, surrounded by fallen balloons and the smell of ozone. The morning had been a gauntlet of emotional fluctuations, of approach and repulsion, of warmth and cold. But as the sun climbed higher, casting long golden fingers across the marble floor, Hermione realized that the happily ever after wasn't a destination. It was the friction of two souls rubbing together until they created enough heat to warm even the coldest of castles. "Draco," she said after a long silence. "Yes, Mrs. Malfoy? I think I'm ready for that second course now." He laughed, a sound that was finally, truly free. But as they stood up to face the rest of their first day, neither of them noticed the single black rose that had begun to bloom in the center of the library table. A gift, or perhaps a final warning from the heart of the manor itself. The black rose sat in its crystal vase like a beautiful, silent threat. Its petals were not merely dark, they were a void, absorbing the morning light rather than reflecting it. Hermione stared at it, her fingers hovering inches from the velvet-soft thorns. She could feel the static electricity humming in the air around the bloom, a tactile friction that made the tips of her fingers tingle with a warning she didn't need a textbook to translate. "Don't touch it." Draco's voice came from the doorway, sharp and devoid of its usual playful lilt. He had changed his soot-stained jacket for a fresh one of deep navy, but the shadows under his eyes remained. He walked toward the table, his gaze fixed on the flower, as if it were a venomous snake coiled among the remnants of their chaotic breakfast. "What is it?" Hermione asked, her voice a hushed whisper. "I've never seen a botanical manifestation of a house's grudge before." Draco stopped beside her, the scent of fresh rain and expensive soap clinging to him. He didn't answer immediately. He reached out, his hand covering hers to keep it away from the rose. His palm was dry and warm, a solid anchor against the rising tide of her unease. "It's a Malfoy heirloom, or a curse, depending on which century's chronicles you're reading. It's called a nigra spes, the Black Hope. It only blooms when the magic of the manor feels its core identity is being rewritten." Hermione looked up at him, her brow furrowed. Rewritten? You make it sound like I'm editing a manuscript, Draco, not living in a house. To the manor, you are an editor, he said, his thumb tracing a slow, absent-minded circle over the back of her hand. The non-verbal intimacy of the gesture was a stark contrast to the grimness of his words. You've spent the last 4 hours tearing down the silence, inviting in the unwashed masses, his word for your friends, not mine, and forcing the foundations to recognize a bloodline it doesn't understand. The rose is the house's way of saying it's paying attention. He let go of her hand, but the absence of his touch felt like a sudden drop in temperature. He picked up a silver letter opener and nudged the vase. The rose didn't move, but the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to deepen. "Is it dangerous?" Hermione asked, her internal monologue already racing through countercurses and protective charms. "It's a barometer," Draco replied, his tone shifting back to that guarded aristocratic mask. "If it stays black, we're in for a rough transition. If it starts to change, then perhaps the house is beginning to tolerate you. But for now, I suggest we treat it like a sleeping dragon." The emotional seesaw tilted toward cold. The brief moment of unity they had shared on the floor of the library felt like it was being eclipsed by the weight of his heritage. Draco looked at the rose with a mixture of reverence and resentment that Hermione couldn't quite penetrate. It was a reminder that no matter how much he loved her, he was still a product of this place. The rot he so often alluded to wasn't just in the walls, it was in the very magic he used to protect her. "I have to go to the ministry for an hour," Draco said abruptly, not looking at her. "The marriage contract needs to be filed with the Department of Magical Records, and since we bypassed the standard 3-month engagement period, there are questions." "Questions?" Hermione echoed, a spark of her usual fire returning. "We are 2 consenting adults, Draco. What business is it of the ministry how fast we chose to commit?" "It's not the speed, Hermione, it's the optics," he snapped, his eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp irritation. "A Malfoy marrying a war hero of your stature is a political event, not just a romantic one. They want to ensure I haven't used a confundus charm on the Golden Girl to secure my family's assets." The word Golden Girl felt like a slur coming from him, a reminder of the labels that had once defined their enmity. The tension between them spiked, the magnetic pull turning into a jarring repulsion. "And you're just going to go and file it? Like a transaction?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of hurt and anger. Draco sighed, the sound jagged and weary. He stepped closer, closing the gap until he was once again in her personal space. He reached out, his fingers catching a stray curl that had escaped her pins. The touch was tentative, a silent plea for understanding that he couldn't quite put into words. "I am going to ensure that no one can ever question your right to be here," he whispered. "I am going to make it official so that even the ministry's board clerks have to acknowledge you as Lady Malfoy. Do you think I want to leave you here with that?" He jerked his chin toward the black rose. "I'd rather stay and watch you argue with the portraits all day. But this is the world we live in." Hermione leaned into his touch, her anger dissolving into a dull ache of vulnerability. "I don't like being Lady Malfoy when you're not here. It feels like I'm wearing someone else's skin." "You're not wearing anyone's skin but your own," he murmured, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw. "And you're doing a much better job with it than my mother ever did. Just stay out of the cellar. And for Merlin's sake, don't try to teach the house elves about labour unions while I'm gone. I don't want to come back to a picket line." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a chaste, lingering contact that felt like a seal on a contract of its own. Then, with a swirl of his navy robes and the sharp crack of apparition, he was gone. The silence of the manor rushed back in, filling the space he had occupied like water rushing into a vacuum. Hermione stood alone in the library, the black rose her only companion. She wasn't a woman who fared well in silence. Her mind was a machine that required fuel, and without Draco's friction to spark it, she began to drift. She looked at the library, the rows of books that contained secrets both beautiful and terrible. She thought about the shadow she had fought, the way it had whispered about her belonging. "I am the grit in the oyster," she thought, her internal monologue taking on a darker hue. She decided to work. If she couldn't be a wife in this moment, she would be a scholar. She approached the desk, avoiding the black rose, and began to sort through the stack of documents she had brought with her. But as she moved a heavy inkwell, she noticed a small leather-bound journal tucked behind a row of encyclopedias. It didn't have a name on the spine, only a silver crest, the Malfoy serpent, but with its eyes missing. Curiosity, that old Gryffindor vice, flared in her chest. She opened the book. The handwriting was cramped, elegant, and filled with a frantic energy. It didn't belong to Draco or Lucius. It was older. Day 412 of the silence, the first entry began. "The house has stopped breathing again. It demands a sacrifice of joy. My wife cries in the solarium, and I find myself wishing for the touch of something common, something loud. This purity is a slow poison. We are dying in our own perfection." Hermione felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She read on, her eyes skimming over descriptions of a life lived in a gilded cage. It was a chronicle of the very rot Draco had mentioned, but written by someone who had clearly loved the house and hated it in equal measure. "It's not just us," she whispered to the empty room. "It's always been this way." As she turned the page, a small dried petal fell out of the book. It wasn't black. It was a pale, faded pink, almost white. Suddenly, the library doors creaked open. Hermione jumped, nearly dropping the journal. She expected Draco, or perhaps Mippy with more tea. Instead, she saw a woman standing in the doorway. She was tall, ethereal, with hair the colour of spun silver and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. She was wearing a gown of ivory lace that looked like it belonged in a different era. For a moment, Hermione's heart stopped. Was it a ghost? A manifestation of the manor's history? "It's a lovely book, isn't it?" the woman said. Her voice was like the ringing of a crystal bell, clear, cold, and profoundly sad. "My husband wrote it when he realized that being a Malfoy meant being a curator of a museum of one's own regrets." You're a portrait," Hermione gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She looked toward the wall where a large, ornate frame had previously held a landscape of the Wiltshire Downs. The frame was now empty. "I prefer the term resident observer," the woman replied, stepping into the room. She wasn't solid, but she wasn't translucent either. She moved with a grace that made the air around her ripple. "I am Cygnus's wife, one of the many Lady Malfoys who found the silk sheets a bit too much like a shroud. She walked toward the table, her gaze falling on the black rose. A small, sad smile touched her lips. Ah, the black hope. It hasn't bloomed since my son brought home a girl from the village and tried to convince us she was a long-lost cousin of the Black family. The house knew, of course. The house always knows when a lie is being told. "I'm not a lie," Hermione said, her voice regaining its strength. "And I'm not a secret." "No," the woman agreed, turning to look at Hermione. Her gaze was piercing, an atmospheric pressure that felt like it was stripping away Hermione's defenses. "You are something much more dangerous. You are the truth. And this house has spent 1,000 years trying to drown the truth in gold." She moved closer, her ivory lace trailing like mist across the floor. "Do you love him? Or do you love the idea of fixing him? Many of us made that mistake, thinking we could be the light that burned away the shadows. But the shadows here are very, very deep." The betrayal of the woman's words stung. Hermione felt the doubt she'd been fighting all morning flare up into a visceral fear. Was she just another in a long line of women who thought they could change the unchangeable? "I love Draco," Hermione said, her voice firm. "And he is not his ancestors. He is not this house." "He is this house," the woman countered softly. "He is the stone, and the blood, and the silence. If you try to pull him out of it too fast, you'll both shatter." She reached out, her hand passing through the black rose. The petals shivered, and for a fleeting second, a vein of deep blood red appeared in the center of the black. "The house is testing you, child. It will offer you warmth, and then it will freeze you out. It will make you trust its walls, and then it will try to crush you. The question is, what are you willing to give up to stay?" Before Hermione could answer, the woman began to fade. Her ivory gown dissolved into the morning light, and the empty frame on the wall suddenly flickered back into a landscape of the downs. "Wait!" Hermione called out, but the only response was the soft tink of the crystal vase against the table. She was alone again, but the air felt different, thicker, more expectant. She looked at the black rose. The red vein was still there, a tiny, pulsing heart in the middle of the darkness. Approach, repulsion, warmth, cold. The seesaw was in full motion now. Hermione sat back in her chair, the leather creaking under her weight. She felt a sudden, frantic need to see Draco, to feel the reality of him against the haunting whispers of his past. She looked at the clock on the mantel. He had only been gone for 20 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. She stood up, driven by a restless energy. If she couldn't leave and she couldn't work, she would explore. She would map this cage until she knew every bar. She walked out of the library and headed toward the one place Draco had told her not to go. Not because she wanted to disobey him, but because the truth of this house wasn't in the silk-lined bedrooms or the grand dining halls. It was in the dark. The stairs to the cellar were narrow, carved from the cold grey stone of the original foundation. As she descended, the scent of the manor changed. The lavender and sandalwood vanished, replaced by the smell of damp earth, iron, and something ancient, the scent of ozone after a hex. The air grew heavy, the atmospheric pressure pressing against her lungs. Her wand light flickered, the shadows stretching out to meet her like eager hands. She reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself in a vaulted chamber filled with crates, old furniture, and the discarded remnants of a dozen generations. It was the attic of the underworld, and there, in the center of the room, sat a large velvet-covered object. Hermione moved toward it, her heart hammering. She reached out and pulled the fabric away. It was a mirror, but it wasn't the mirror of Erist or any magical glass she had ever encountered. The frame was made of black iron, twisted into the shape of thorns, and as she looked into it, she didn't see her reflection. She saw the manor, but it was different. The walls were transparent, revealing the layers of magic that held it together like a spiderweb. And in the center of the web, she saw two figures, Draco and herself. They were bound together by a shimmering silver cord, but the cord was being pulled in opposite directions. On one side, the manor was tugging at Draco, trying to pull him back into the stone. On the other, a bright, chaotic light, her light, was trying to pull him toward a world of color and noise. The cord was fraying. Hermione felt a wave of visceral terror. The internal conflict she had sensed in Draco wasn't just a mood. It was a literal battle for his soul, and she was the one causing the strain. "Is this what I'm doing to him?" she whispered, her voice echoing in the cold chamber. Suddenly, a hand gripped her shoulder. She shrieked, spinning around, her wand raised. It was Draco. He was pale, his hair wild, his breathing ragged. He had apparated directly into the cellar, the force of his arrival knocking several old crates over. "I told you," he gasped, his eyes wild with a fear she had never seen before. "I told you not to come down here." He looked at the mirror and then at her. The cold face was gone, replaced by a raw, bleeding vulnerability. He didn't pull her into an embrace. He didn't offer a witty remark. He simply stood there, his hands trembling, looking at the fraying cord in the glass. "You saw it," he said, his voice a jagged ruin. "You saw what happens when you try to love a ghost." The tension in the cellar was unbearable, a magnetic storm that threatened to tear the room apart. The seesaw had reached its peak, and Hermione realized that the next few minutes would decide whether they would survive the morning or become just another set of shadows in the history of the Malfoys. The air in the cellar was thick enough to choke on, tasting of salt and ancient iron. The mirror stood between them like a silent judge, its twisted iron thorns reflecting the flickering light of their wands. Draco didn't move to cover the glass. He simply stared at it, his eyes hollowed out by the realization that his greatest fear, the slow, inevitable erosion of Hermione by the weight of his own world, was no longer a suspicion, but a visible, shimmering reality. "I didn't think you'd find this," he said, his voice barely a thread. The usual melodic drawl was gone, replaced by a jagged rasp that made Hermione's chest tighten. "My grandfather called it the speculum veritas, the mirror of truths. It doesn't show you what you want, like Erist. It shows you the price of what you have." Hermione looked back at the glass. The silver cord connecting them in the reflection was thinner now, the frayed edges glowing with a sickly, rhythmic pulse. The light that represented her was bright, blindingly so, but the transparent walls of the manor were closing in, the stone absorbing the radiance, turning it into a dull, muffled grey. "The price," she whispered, her voice echoing off the damp stone walls. "The price is you, isn't it? You're being pulled apart." Draco finally looked at her. The cold mask he had worn since his return from the ministry shattered, revealing a visceral, raw exhaustion. He stepped forward, the distance between them closing with a magnetic pull that felt like atmospheric pressure before a storm. He reached out, his fingers brushing the soot-stained silk of her sleeve before his hand slid down to grip her wrist. The contact was desperate, a tactile friction that sought to ground him in the present. "I am a Malfoy, Hermione," he said, his jaw tight. "The stones know my name. The wards recognize my blood. Every time I choose you, every time I let your friends in, every time I let you change a room, every time I kiss you, the house demands a tax. It's trying to pull the Malfoy back into the foundation. And if it can't have me, it will try to extinguish the thing that's taking me away." He pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her chaotic curls. His forehead rested against hers, and for a moment the world of ghosts and fraying cords vanished. There was only the heat of his skin and the scent of sandalwood and desperation. "I went to the ministry," he whispered against her skin. "I filed the papers. I fought with the goblins about the dowry. I did everything I could to make you untouchable, but I can't protect you from the air you breathe in this house." The warmth of his embrace was undercut by a sudden, sharp repulsion in Hermione's mind. Not repulsion for him, but for the situation. She felt a surge of her old, defiant Gryffindor fire. She was being treated like a victim, a fragile thing that needed to be shielded from the shadows. She pushed against his chest, not to leave him, but to look him in the eye. "Stop it, Draco. Stop acting like this is a tragedy you're watching from the sidelines. I am not a delicate piece of porcelain that's going to shatter because the air is a bit heavy. I am a witch. I am the woman who helped end a war. If the house wants to pull at our connection, let it pull. I've survived worse than a haunted basement." Draco's eyes flared with a mix of irritation and admiration, the can't help but think look that had always drawn him to her. "This isn't a duel, Hermione. You can't just hex the foundation into submission. It's a slow burn. It's the way the silence starts to feel comfortable. It's the way you'll eventually stop wanting to bring flowers into the library because the shadows look better without them." "Then we change the shadows," she snapped. She turned back to the mirror and raised her wand. The wood of her wand hummed, reacting to the volatile magic of the cellar. "If the cord is fraying, we weave it stronger. We don't wait for it to break." "What are you doing?" Draco asked, his voice rising in alarm. "A binding of intent," she said, her mind racing through the complex arithmancy of the spell. "It's ancient, risky, and highly unconventional. But if we tie our magic together, not just our blood or our names, but our actual raw intent, the house won't be able to distinguish between us. It won't be able to pull you one way and me the other. We'll be a single, immovable point." Draco looked at her as if she had suggested jumping off the astronomy tower. "That's a soul link, Hermione. If one of us falters, the other falls. If the house rejects us then, it will destroy us both." "Trust me," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. She reached out her hand, palm up. "You said I was the only thing in this house that's real. Let's make that reality permanent." The emotional seesaw stalled. The tension was no longer about the house or the ancestors. It was about the two of them, standing on the edge of a precipice. Trust versus doubt. Betrayal of their individual selves for a collective whole. Draco looked at her hand, then at her face. He saw the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide behind her intellect, the way her lower lip trembled just a fraction. He saw the woman who had walked into his life and turned his curated silence into a beautiful, terrifying noise. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his hand in hers. The moment their palms met, the speculum veritas let out a low, vibrating hum. The iron thorns of the frame began to glow with a cold blue light. "Together," Draco whispered, his fingers interlacing with hers. Hermione began the incantation. The words were Latin, but the power behind them was something older, something primal. As she spoke, she felt her magic surge out of her, a golden liquid heat that flowed down her arm and into Draco. At the same time, she felt his magic, cold, precise, and silver, flowing into her. The tactile friction was unlike anything she had ever felt. It wasn't just skin on skin. It was the very essence of their beings rubbing together, creating a static charge that made the air around them crackle with ozone. In the mirror, the two figures began to change. The silver cord didn't just stop fraying. It began to thicken, the light from Hermione and the silver from Draco braiding themselves into a rope of unbreakable brilliance. The transparent walls of the manor in the reflection shuddered. The stones seemed to groan, a deep tectonic sound that vibrated through the soles of their feet. Suddenly, the mirror shattered. The glass didn't fly outward. It simply collapsed into a pile of shimmering dust. The darkness of the cellar rushed back in, but it was no longer oppressive. The atmospheric pressure had equalized. Hermione slumped against Draco, her energy spent. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her with a strength that felt different now, more certain, less desperate. The internal conflict that had plagued him all morning seemed to have settled into a quiet, determined peace. "Did it work?" she gasped, her breath hitching. Draco didn't answer with words. He reached out with his magic, a sensation she could now feel as clearly as a touch, and she felt a wave of calm, silver reassurance wash over her. He was no longer a ghost in a machine. He was the machine itself, and she was the power source. "The house is quiet," he said, his voice sounding clearer than it had all day. "It's not happy, but it's quiet. It knows it can't separate us now." He pulled back just enough to look at her. The slow burn of their morning had reached a new stage. The tension between them had shifted from the external plot of the manor to the internal reality of their union. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek, which was now smudged with dust and sweat. "You're a mess, Granger," he murmured, a genuine, lopsided smirk finally appearing on his face. "And you're a Malfoy," she countered, leaning into his hand. "I think we're even." They stood there for a long time, in the quiet dark of the cellar, listening to the house settle. The approach had finally won over the repulsion. But as they turned to leave, Hermione noticed something on the floor where the mirror had stood, a single silver key. She picked it up. It was cold to the touch, but it didn't hum with dark magic. It felt like a gift. "What's this?" she asked. Draco looked at the key, his expression unreadable. "That's the key to the cellarium, the one my mother locked after my father, after the war. It's the brightest room in the house. It's where the light stays, even when the sun goes down." He took the key from her, his fingers brushing hers. The magnetic pull was stronger than ever, a constant underlying hum in their shared magic. "I think," Draco said, his eyes softening. It's time we stopped hiding in the library and the cellar. If we're going to be the truth of this house, we might as well do it where everyone can see. They climbed the stairs together, their footsteps echoing in a rhythm that finally felt like a melody instead of a march. As they reached the main floor, the morning sun was at its zenith, pouring through the windows in a flood of gold. They passed the library, and Hermione glanced at the table. The black rose was no longer black. The red vein in the center had spread, turning the petals a deep, vibrant crimson, the color of a Gryffindor banner or a heart that was finally learning how to beat. Draco saw it too. He didn't say anything, but his grip on her hand tightened. They walked toward the west wing, past the repaired window and the now silent suits of armor. They reached the double doors of the cellarium, and Draco inserted the silver key. The lock turned with a smooth, musical click. The doors swung open, and for a moment, Hermione was blinded by the light. The cellarium was a cathedral of glass, filled with overgrown vines, white marble statues, and the scent of sleeping earth. It was beautiful, wild, and utterly devoid of Malfoy pretension. It was a place that had been waiting for someone to breathe life back into it. "Well," Draco said, stepping into the room and pulling her with him. "It's a bit of a project. I imagine you'll want to reorganize the plants by their medicinal properties." Hermione laughed, a bright, clear sound that seemed to make the glass panes vibrate. "Actually, I think I just want to sit here, with you, and do absolutely nothing for at least an hour." "Nothing?" Draco arched an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound like the Hermione Granger I know. Where are the lists, the schedules, the 5-year plan for the restoration of the Malfoy reputation?" "The plan is right here," she said, stepping into his arms. The tension between them was different now. It was the tension of a bowstring about to be released. The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was thick, heavy with the promise of what was to come. Draco looked down at her, his eyes searching hers, and for the first time that morning there was no shadow of the past between them. But just as he leaned in, his lips inches from hers, a loud, indignant squawk echoed from the rafters. A very large, very grumpy-looking owl was perched on a marble bust of Brutus Malfoy, clutching a letter with a bright purple seal. Draco groaned, his head dropping onto Hermione's shoulder. "Please tell me that's not another Weasley." "Worse," Hermione said, looking at the seal. "It's Kingsley Shacklebolt. He probably wants to know if we're coming to the gala tonight." Draco pulled back, his mask of aristocratic annoyance returning, but this time it was laced with a genuine, weary humour. "Tell him we're busy. Tell him the house is being renovated. Tell him I've been kidnapped by a Gryffindor and I'm currently being forced to enjoy myself." "I think I can manage that." Hermione smiled. She took the letter from the owl, but she didn't open it. Instead, she threw it onto a nearby stone bench. The seesaw had finally found its balance. They were together, they were whole, and the manor was finally, slowly, becoming a home. But as the owl flew away, Hermione noticed a small folded piece of parchment that had fallen from its leg. It wasn't part of the official letter. She picked it up and read the single line of elegant, familiar script. "The first day is always the hardest. The rest is just magic." It was signed with a simple N. Hermione looked at Draco, who was busy trying to convince a particularly stubborn vine to move away from the seating area. She didn't show him the note. Some secrets were meant to be kept, and some lights were meant to be shared only with the shadows they belonged to. She walked over to him, the crimson rose of the house's acceptance blooming in her mind, and for the first time since she had woken up, she felt truly, perfectly at home. The cellarium was a sprawling lung of glass and iron, a place where the manor's suffocating history seemed to pause for breath. The wild, untamed greenery, vines of devil's snare that had grown sluggish in the sun, and pots of dirigible plums that bobbed like orange bubbles, created a chaotic sanctuary that felt more like Hermione's soul than Draco's heritage. Yet, the air here still held a residual atmospheric pressure, a lingering static from the soul-binding they had performed in the dark of the cellar. Hermione stood by a tall, arched pane of glass, watching the way the light caught the silver ring on her finger. The bite of the metal against her skin was no longer a cold intrusion. It was part of the visceral alignment of her magic with Draco's. She could feel him behind her, not just his physical presence, but the rhythmic pulse of his intent. Since the mirror had shattered, the internal monologue of her doubts had quieted, replaced by a strange magnetic resonance with the man who was currently attempting to prune a particularly aggressive rosebush with a silver dagger. "You're doing it wrong," she said, her voice soft but carrying that familiar scholarly edge. Draco paused, the dagger glinting in the sunlight. He turned to look at her, his charcoal grey waistcoat discarded on a marble bench, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the pale, muscular planes of his forearms. The restrained, morally grey scion was gone for a moment, replaced by a man who looked genuinely frustrated by a plant. "It's a Malfoy thornback, Hermione," he drawled, the silver blonde hair falling over his eyes. "It doesn't respond to 'please' or 'thank you.' It responds to sharp objects and a lack of empathy, much like my great-aunt Enid." Hermione walked toward him, the silk of her ruined blue dress whispering against the stone floor. She stopped just inside his personal space, the tactile friction of their proximity making the air feel thick and sweet. She took the dagger from his hand, her fingers lingering against his skin. The touch sent a jiver of warmth through the silver cord that now bound their magic. "It doesn't need empathy, Draco. It needs a specific frequency of vibration," she corrected. She hummed a low melodic note and tapped the stem of the rosebush with the flat of the blade. The thorns immediately retracted, the leaves curling inward in a gesture of submission. Draco watched her, his grey eyes darkening with a mixture of amusement and a deep, aching vulnerability. "Of course. You've been a Malfoy for 6 hours, and you're already lecturing the flora on the laws of physics. Why did I think this would be a quiet afternoon?" "Because you're a prat who enjoys being lectured," she teased, leaning against the potting table. The humour was a thin veil over the emotional intensity that still simmered between them. The seesaw of the morning had left them both raw, the fluctuations between warmth and cold having stripped away the armour they usually wore. Draco reached out, his hand hovering near her waist before he finally committed to the touch. He pulled her flush against him, his hands resting on the small of her back, the heat of his body a solid grounding force. "I can still feel it," he whispered, his face dipping toward the crook of her neck. "The way your magic hums. It's like having a hive of bees living under my skin. It's exhausting. Is it a bad exhausting? She asked, her breath hitching as his lips brushed against her pulse point. It's the kind of exhausting that makes everything else, the ministry, the war, the name, feel like a background noise I can finally ignore. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his expression turning serious. But the house isn't finished, Hermione. The cellarium is a neutral territory, but the drawing room, the cellar, they still remember. The cold phase returned briefly, a flicker of the internal guilt that Draco carried like a heavy mantle. He felt responsible for the manor's hostility, for the way the stones had tried to reject her. He looked at her as if he were waiting for her to realize the weight of the cage he'd invited her into. "We aren't going back to the cellar today," Hermione said firmly, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "And the drawing room can stay under its dust covers until I've had at least 3 more cups of tea. We have achieved a visceral alignment, Draco. The house knows you chose me. That's enough for one morning." She felt the tension in his shoulders break, the approach winning over the repulsion. He let out a long, shaky breath, burying his face in her hair. The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was overwhelming. The way they breathed in unison, the way the sunlight through the glass seemed to bake the scent of them together. But the peace of the cellarium was a fragile thing. A sharp, metallic clink echoed from the far corner of the room. A large, ornate birdcage, which had been empty for decades, suddenly began to shake. Inside, a mechanical bird made of gold and sapphire flickered to life, its wings beating with a jarring staccato sound. It began to sing, not a melody, but a series of sharp, discordant notes that sounded like a warning. Draco went rigid, his hand flying to his wand. "What is that? I haven't seen that thing move since I was 5. "It's reacting to the ministry letter," Hermione realized, looking back at the stone bench where she tossed Shacklebolt's missive. The purple seal was glowing with a sickly, rhythmic light. "It's a proximity alarm. Someone is at the gates." "If it's Weasley again, I'm going to turn the gates into a swamp," Draco growled. But as he moved toward the door, the mechanical bird song changed. It became a low, mournful dirge. The atmospheric pressure in the room spiked. The glass panes of the cellarium rattled in their iron frames, and the sunlight seemed to dim, turned a bruised purple by the sudden influx of dark magic at the estate's perimeter. "It's not Ron," Draco said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "That's the uninvited kin alert. Someone from the inner circle, or what's left of it, is trying to force the wards." Hermione felt a surge of fear, the trust she had built in their safety suddenly under siege. "Who? Everyone who could hurt us is in Azkaban or gone." "Not everyone," Draco said, his face hardening into the mask of the Malfoy air. He grabbed his waistcoat and pulled it on, the transition from vulnerable husband to Lord of the Manor happening in a heartbeat. "Wait here. Don't leave the cellarium. The binding we did will keep the house from attacking you, but it won't protect you from whatever is at the gate." "I am not waiting here while you walk into a potential ambush," she protested, her wand snapping into her hand with a sharp crack of sparks. "We are tied together, remember? If you go, I go." The friction between them flared, his need to protect her clashing with her need to be his equal. They stood in the center of the beautiful, wild cellarium, 2 figures caught in a magnetic storm of their own making. Hermione, please, he said, his eyes pleading. Just once, let me be the one who stands in front. Not because you're weak, but because I need to know I can do it. She looked at him, seeing the broken parts of him that were trying so hard to mend themselves through this act of chivalry. She felt the internal conflict within him, the desire to be her shield versus the fear of losing her. Fine, she whispered, but if you aren't back in 5 minutes, I'm bringing the devil's snare with me. Draco leaned in, giving her a quick, fierce kiss that tasted of salt and determination, and then he was gone, his boots echoing sharply against the stone. Hermione sat on the marble bench, the silence of the cellarium now feeling heavy and ominous. She watched the mechanical bird, its sapphire wings still twitching. The seesaw of her emotions was in a frantic state. Approach, repulsion, warmth, cold. She felt the silver cord in her mind vibrating, a rhythmic pulse that told her Draco was moving fast toward the front of the house. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The mechanical bird stopped singing. The purple light on the ministry letter died out. The cellarium went completely, unnervingly still. Hermione couldn't take it. She stood up, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She walked to the doors of the cellarium and pushed them open. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows, the light from the garden not reaching the interior of the house. "Draco!" she called out, her voice a fragile thing in the vast space. No answer. She moved toward the great hall, her wand light a small, flickering star in the darkness. As she neared the front of the house, she heard voices, low, tense, and biting. "You have no right to be here," Draco was saying. His voice was cold, a blade of ice. "The contract is signed. The name is hers. The name is a curse, Draco, and you've shared it with a girl who will never understand the weight of the blood on these floors." The second voice was female, aristocratic, and filled with a weary, ancient venom. Hermione rounded the corner and stopped. Standing in the entrance hall, framed by the massive oak doors, was a woman she recognized from old photographs and court transcripts. It was Andromeda Tonks, or rather, the woman who looked like a shadow of the sister she had lost, Bellatrix. But this wasn't Bellatrix. It was the disowned sister, looking at Draco with a mixture of pity and rage. "Andromeda," Hermione whispered, stepping into the light. The woman turned. Her eyes were like Draco's, silver and flint, but they were tired, lined with the grief of a woman who had lost everything to the name Malfoy. "So, the lioness finally enters the den," Andromeda said, her voice softening just a fraction. "I didn't come to attack, Hermione. I came to see if my nephew had truly lost his mind, or if he was simply trying to find a way to survive the rot." Draco stepped between them, his posture rigid. "She's not a way to survive, Aunt. She is my wife. And if you've come here to lecture us on the weight of the blood, you can do it from the other side of the gates." The tension in the hall was visceral. Andromeda looked around at the pristine marble, the repaired windows, and then at the way Draco's hand was subtly reaching back to find Hermione's. She saw the silver cord, even if she couldn't see the magic. "The house is changing," Andromeda noted, her gaze returning to Hermione. "I can smell it. It smells like ozone and common sense, a dangerous combination for a Malfoy." She reached into her cloak and pulled out a small velvet pouch. She stepped forward, ignoring Draco's defensive flinch, and held it out to Hermione. "My mother gave this to me before I was burned off the tapestry," Andromeda said. "It's a seed from the original Black Garden. It only grows in soil that has been cleansed by a true union. If it blooms, the house is yours. If it withers, then you're just another ghost in the making." Hermione took the pouch, the weight of the gift feeling like a heavy stone in her hand. The trust she felt in this unexpected ally was tempered by the doubt Andromeda had cast on their future. "Why give this to me?" Hermione asked. "Because," Andromeda said, turning toward the open doors, "I'm tired of seeing this family die in the dark. And because you, Hermione Granger, are the only person I've ever met who is stubborn enough to argue with a stone." With a final lingering look at Draco, a look that held a lifetime of unspoken apologies, Andromeda stepped out into the mist and vanished. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the heavy, polished silence of the morning. It was a vibrating, expectant thing. Draco turned to Hermione, his face pale, his mask finally crumbling. He looked at the velvet pouch in her hand, then at her eyes. "Everyone wants to test us," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The house, the ancestors, my family. It never stops, does it?" Hermione stepped into his arms, the warmth of her presence a visceral alignment against his cold fear. She pulled him close, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady, frantic beat of his heart. "Let them test us," she said, her voice fierce with a newfound certainty. "We've already passed the hardest one. We chose each other." She pulled back and looked at him, her eyes shining with a playful, defiant light. "Now, I believe we have a garden to plant. And after that, Draco Malfoy, you are going to take me to that dinner gala, and we are going to show the entire wizarding world exactly what the rot looks like when it's been replaced by a Gryffindor." Draco laughed, a real chest-deep sound that shook the shadows of the great hall. He leaned down, his lips finally meeting hers, in a kiss that was neither cautious nor restrained. It was a visceral, tactile friction of two souls finally finding their rhythm. The morning was over. The marriage had begun. And as they walked back toward the heart of the manor, the mechanical bird in the solarium began to sing once more. A clear, sweet melody that sounded remarkably like a welcome. The evening had begun to settle over Wiltshire, draping the sprawling gardens of Malfoy Manor in a veil of violet and bruised indigo. In the solarium, the air was warm, smelling of damp earth and the sharp electric scent of the soul binding that still hummed in the corners of the room. Hermione stood before a large ceramic pot, the velvet pouch from Andromeda Tonks clutched in her hand. The seed inside felt heavy, pulsating with a dormant, ancient power that seemed to react to the silver ring on her finger. Beside her, Draco had abandoned all pretense of aristocratic distance. He had discarded his waistcoat entirely, his white shirt open at the collar, the fine silk clinging to the sweat-dampened skin of his back. He was watching her with an intensity that made the atmospheric pressure in the room rise, a magnetic pull that had nothing to do with the house, and everything to do with the woman who had turned his world into a chaotic, beautiful construction site. "If this doesn't grow," Draco murmured, his voice low and jagged, "I'm burning the tapestry. I'll start with the West Wing and work my way to the dungeons." "It will grow," Hermione said, though a flicker of doubt, That old, persistent shadow brushed against her mind. She looked at him, seeing the way the fading light caught the sharp lines of his face, the vulnerability he usually kept locked behind a mask of silver and flint. The house isn't just stone and blood anymore, Draco. It's us, and we are very, very stubborn. She knelt on the stone floor, her movements fluid despite the exhaustion that weighed on her limbs. With a steady hand, she pressed the seed into the dark, rich soil. As her fingers touched the earth, she felt a visceral alignment, a surge of her own golden magic flowing down into the pot, met by a cool silver current from the house's foundation. The tactile friction was exhilarating, a rhythmic pulse that signaled the manor's begrudging acceptance of its new mistress. Draco knelt beside her, his hand covering hers, pressing their palms together over the buried seed. The contact was an anchor. The seesaw of their morning, the approach and repulsion, the warmth and the biting cold, finally slowed to a steady, balanced hum. "Together," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The mechanical bird in the corner sat silent. Then, a soft green light began to emanate from the soil. A tiny, silver-veined shoot broke the surface, spiraling upward with a speed that defied nature. It didn't bloom into a black rose or a thorny vine. Instead, it unfurled into a delicate, luminous flower with petals that shifted between Gryffindor crimson and Malfoy silver. The scent that filled the cellarium was intoxicating. Fresh rain, old books, and the sweet, lingering heat of a summer night. Draco let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the wedding ceremony. He sat back on his heels, a genuine, lopsided smile breaking through his exhaustion. "Well, it appears the soil is sufficiently cleansed. My ancestors are likely spinning in their portraits, which is a thought that brings me an unreasonable amount of joy." Hermione laughed, a bright, clear sound that echoed through the glass cathedral. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, the silk of her dress rustling against his shirt. The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was thick, a shared silence that felt more profound than any vow they had spoken before the ministry. "You're a mess, Lord Malfoy," she teased, reaching up to wipe a smudge of dirt from his cheek. "And you, Lady Malfoy, are a riot," he countered, catching her hand and kissing her palm. The bite of his ring was a familiar, comforting pressure. "Are you truly going to make me go to this gala? I'm fairly certain I have dirt under my fingernails and a soul link that makes me want to do nothing but stare at you for the next 48 hours. "Especially because of those things," she insisted, pulling him up. "We have to show them, Draco. We have to show them that we aren't ghosts, that the manor isn't a tomb. And besides," she added with a mischievous glint in her eyes, "I want to see the look on Pansy Parkinson's face when she sees what I've done to your library." Draco chuckled, the sound vibrating through the silver cord that bound them. "You're terrifying. I love it." The transition from the wild, earthy warmth of the cellarium to the cold, polished grandeur of the master suite was seamless this time. The house no longer felt like a predator waiting to strike. It felt like a silent observer, watching the two of them navigate its halls with a new, shared authority. As they dressed for the evening, the internal monologue of Hermione's fears had been replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. She chose a gown of deep, shimmering emerald, a nod to his house, but pinned a small golden lion brooch to her shoulder. Draco watched her from the doorway of the dressing room, his eyes dark with a visceral, possessive pride. He looked every bit the morally grey aristocrat in his black dress robes, but the way he looked at her was raw and unshielded. "You look like a war," he said softly, walking toward her. "A war?" she asked, turning to face him. "The kind people write songs about, the kind that changes the map forever." He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her throat before settling on her waist. He pulled her close, the magnetic pull between them reaching a fever pitch. "I'm not sure I'm ready to share you with a room full of ministry sycophants." "Then don't," she whispered, her hands sliding up his chest to rest at the nape of his neck. "Just remember who you're coming home to." The tension in the room was electric, a slow burn that had been building since they first woke up in the oversized silk bed. Draco leaned in, his lips ghosting over hers, a silent inquiry that she answered by pulling him closer. The kiss was everything the morning hadn't been. It was certain, deep, and filled with a desperate, triumphant happiness. It wasn't the kiss of a hero and a villain. It was the kiss of two survivors who had built a bridge over a chasm of hate. The tactile friction of his lips against hers, the taste of him, the way his hands gripped her as if she were the only solid thing in a shifting world. It was the final, definitive approach. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless, their magic humming in a beautiful, chaotic harmony. "The gala," Draco reminded her, though his voice was thick with reluctance. "The gala," she agreed, straightening his collar. They walked down the grand staircase together, their footsteps echoing in a rhythm that finally felt like a home. The portraits were silent, but as they passed Lucius III, the old man didn't scoff. He simply watched them, his painted eyes reflecting the light of the new crimson and silver flower that Hermione had tucked into her hair. At the front doors, Mippy was waiting, looking tidier and more confident than she had all day. She opened the massive oak doors with a flourish, the cool evening air rushing in to meet them. "The carriage is ready, master. Mistress," she squeaked, her eyes shining. "And Mippy has moved the welcome home banner to the ballroom. It is very bright." Draco groaned, but there was no real heat in it. "Of course it is." He stepped out onto the gravel path, then paused, turning back to offer Hermione his hand. The moonlight caught the silver of his hair and the intensity of his gaze. "Are you ready, Hermione? Once we step through those gates, the whole world is going to know that the Malfoy Manor has a heart again." Hermione took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, the silver cord between them glowing with an unbreakable brilliance. She looked back at the house, the dark stone, the glowing windows, the sprawling vines of the cellarium. It was still a fortress, still a place of shadows, but it was no longer her cage. It was her foundation. "I've been ready for a long time, Draco," she said. They walked toward the gates, the seesaw of their journey finally coming to rest. There would be more challenges, more doubts, and more battles with the ghosts of the past. But as they stepped into the carriage, the manor behind them seemed to exhale, a long, soft sound of stone settling into a new reality. In the quiet of the carriage, as it began to move toward London, Draco pulled her into his lap, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, protective warmth. He leaned down and kissed her again. A long, slow, lingering contact that tasted of the future. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "I know," she smiled, her eyes reflecting the stars. "I read it in a book once." He laughed, a bright, clear sound that chased away the last of the morning shadows. And as the carriage disappeared into the mist, the only thing left behind was the scent of rain, old parchment, and the vibrant, blooming heart of a house that had finally learned how to love.
Thank you for staying with me until the end. This story is about more than magic. It is about two people from different worlds. Draco and Hermione had many fears, they had many doubts, but they chose to build a home together. I wanted to show that even the coldest places can become warm. The Malfoy Manor was a dark castle, but with love and a little bit of house, it became a house of light. Sometimes life feels like a cold castle. Sometimes we feel like we do not belong. But remember this, you are the light in your own story. Do not be afraid of the shadows. Just find the person who holds your hand in the dark. I hope you enjoyed this journey with Draco and Hermione. Their story is just beginning, and maybe yours is too. Love, your storyteller.